Yesterday, we talked about the French and Indian War and how it caused the British to go into debt. In order to combat this debt, they decided to tax the colonists more. The colonists were not very happy about this. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the specific taxes that the British decided to impose on the colonists. The French and Indian War made the British go into debt, and they had to create revenue in order to pay it off. The British government realized how much freedom the colonists had under the policy of salutary neglect after the war, and began to enforce the original policy of mercantilism instead. This required the colonies to pay more taxes and to be loyal only to the English and their needs. This is a list of all of the taxes imposed on the colonists after the French and Indian War. The first tax was on the Sugar Act that placed a duty on sugar and foreign luxuries. This is particularly harsh on the colonists because of their love for tea. You do not mess with the British and their tea. The next act was the Currency Act, where colonies could no longer issue paper currency. This made any paper currency in circulation worth nothing. The third act was a year later in 1765, and it was called the Quartering Act. The British left some soldiers after the war to ensure that the new enforcement of mercantilism was being followed by the colonists. These soldiers needed a place to stay and have food to eat, so under the Quartering Act, the colonists were required to allow any British soldier into their home, and they had to provide food and shelter if they were requested to do so. This act is important because the Founding Fathers were so unhappy with this act that they specifically added the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that stated that no citizen should be required to quarter any soldier. This amendment came directly from this act. The fourth act was the Stamp Act. This one was the one that broke the camel's back. This act made all colonists buy stamps for any paper they printed. This made documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and advertisements expensive to produce. The colonists hated this act because it silenced them as they protested against the acts. One of the easiest ways to protest a government is to spread knowledge about their grievances. When the British monarch placed a tax on the newspapers and pamphlets, it made it even harder to spread the word about their complaints. The colonists were absolutely outraged by the Stamp Act and had enough of Parliament and their taxes. After the act was passed, colonists began to truly protest and speak out about their concerns against the British government. Parliament was supposed to represent all British citizens, but the colonists did not have a representation in Parliament. Despite this, they continued to pass laws and tax the colonies. This is where Patrick Henry's most famous quote, "No taxation without representation," began, and it was used throughout the colonies in order to help protest against the British. The colonies created a Stamp Act Congress to help represent the colonies because of the lack of representation in Parliament. They resolved that only their elected officials had the legal authority to approve taxes, not the British Parliament. Thus begins the fight and tension between the colonies and the British Crown. The colonies themselves also took matters into their own hands. A secret society called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty was organized in order to intimidate tax collectors and officials. Many of the colonists also called for boycotts of British goods to help show the Crown how important the colonies were to the British economy. This was the most effective form of protest because the British was quite reliant on the American colonies for revenue. It became a fashionable trend to boycott British goods. This did the trick to repeal the Stamp Act because London merchants put the pressure on Parliament in order to reverse the Stamp Act itself. They were hurting economically without the American exports. The colonists made such an uproar about the Stamp Act and was able to get it repealed that Parliament passed the Declaratory Act to prove that they were allowed to impose these taxes on the colonists. Despite the fact that they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament wanted the colonists to understand that they were the ones in charge, not the colonies. Due to the colonial resistance to British control, Parliament decided they wanted a better watch on the colonies. To do this, they raised taxes on imports of tea, glass, and paper in the Townshend Acts that would help pay for royal official salaries so that they could be independent of the colonial assemblies, further silencing the colonial voice. This also allowed the officials to search homes for smuggled goods with a writ of assistance. With the continual taxation by the British government and the rebellious resistance of the colonies, tensions continued to rise, and there was bound to be an explosion. The first sign of violence was in 1770 during the Boston Massacre. The Sons of Liberty, known for protesting the Stamp Act, forced the British troops to Boston to help protect custom officials because the Sons of Liberty refused to stop hackling them. These troops were quartered there, but were not welcomed by the colonists. An altercation happened between the colonists and the troops, which sparked violence, leaving 5 colonists dead. This was used as propaganda against the British government later by the Sons of Liberty, pushing for a revolution. Here's a video depicting this event.
March 5th, 1770. After 3 days of unrest, an angry mob roams the streets. Hundreds of men who lost their jobs and blame the British gather on King Street and face off against 8 redcoats with orders not to fire. What's about to happen will change America forever. A 17-year-old wigmaker's apprentice, Edward Garrick, lights the fuse. This is how wars start. Private Hugh Montgomery is hit with a club. An African-American, Crispus Attucks, dies instantly. When the smoke clears, 4 more are dead. How Boston reacts will change the course of history. Silversmith and political radical Paul Revere captures the moment British soldiers kill 5 colonists in the streets of Boston. His engraving will fuel the fires of revolution as outrage spreads across the 13 colonies.
Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore, whilst faithless Preston and his savage bands, with murderous rancor, stretch their bloody hands.
The most formidable army in the world, firing on an unarmed crowd. An explosive image with a title that says it all. The Bloody Massacre.
There was the old joke, you give me a picture, I'll give you a war. Those who wanted to stir things up and to make a statement and maybe even lead a revolution, it made them able to rally others to their side.
News spreads fast. The colonists are avid readers, a legacy from the first Bible-reading Puritans in Plymouth. Boston has the first weekly newspaper. There are now more than 40 papers across the colonies. And the new Postmaster General, Benjamin Franklin, has introduced a revolutionary postal delivery system. Night riders cut the delivery time in half. The communications network connecting the colonies is one of the best in the world. And the British have no idea. They hope the news can be contained. Before news reaches England, most of America knows about the Boston Massacre.
It's a very American spirit of an idea, this idea that everybody should have access to knowledge. It's very much like that pioneering idea. Everybody should be able to make their way in the world.
As tensions rose and the British government continued to enforce mercantilism and taxes, colonists became more and more angry and resistant to the king and parliament. The colonists continued to boycott British goods, but felt as though more needed to be done. In 1773, the Sons of Liberty decided to make a bold statement against the king. The British Parliament created the British East Indian Company that came into some financial problems. In order to help these issues, Parliament passed the Tea Act, taxing the tea sold by the company. It is important to keep in mind that the tea from this company was still cheaper than the tea from the Dutch, even though it was taxed. However, it was the principle of having to do as the British said that the colonists were not happy with. Colonists still refused to buy the tea because if they did, that would mean they recognized that Parliament had a right to tax them, and tax them without representation in the first place. When the British East Indian Company brought the tea to the Boston harbor, the colonists did as they threatened and refused to buy the tea, but they were afraid that the governor would have the tea brought ashore and taken to other colonies to be sold. The Sons of Liberty conspired and carried out a plan to rid the tea before it was brought ashore. They disguised themselves as Native American Indians with tomahawks and pistols and boarded the 3 British vessels, with the sole intention of destroying the tea. Successfully, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. No one was hurt, no shots were fired, and no harm was done, except for the destruction of the tea. But the damage to the relationship between the British and the colonists was done, and there was no going back. Here's a video depicting these events.
December 1773. The Boston Gazette breaks another story that will fan the flames of rebellion. The rising tide of anger and resentment forces England's hand. They repeal all taxes, except one on tea. It's not enough. In one of the most famous acts of resistance in American history, rebels dump over $1 million worth of tea in Boston Harbor.
When someone comes along and smacks us, we don't turn the other cheek. That's not who we are.
The British respond by shutting down Boston Harbor, one of America's busiest, wealthiest ports.
Come on out.
Hundreds lose their jobs.
Come on out.
The British mean to strangle any resistance from the rebellious colony of Massachusetts. America is about to change forever.
King George III was the king at the time, and he was very angry about the Boston Tea Party. It showed that the colonists did not respect him as a king. Parliament retaliated by passing a series of punitive acts called the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were directed at punishing the people of Boston and enforcing control. It did 3 things specifically towards Boston, but all of them applied to all colonies. The port of Boston was closed, and they prohibited trade until the tea was paid for. The power of Massachusetts legislature was reduced while increasing the power of the royal governor. Third, the royal officials accused of crimes would be tried in England instead of the colonies. All 3 of these are important because it shows the British unwillingness to hear out the colonists, as well as how far the tensions had rose. This was the beginning of the end. You have come to the end of this lecture. It is important to note that we are building on a story. We already know the ending of the story as the Revolutionary War, but we're trying to figure out how the tensions built and how we got to where we ended up.